Here is the English translation of your script, formatted with proper punctuation and structured into a single paragraph for a smooth narrative flow. The silence as a message. He didn't write again. You look at the screen, see that he was online, see that the message was delivered. You see everything except an answer. And something inside you makes that specific movement, that contraction, that slight fall downward that you already know by heart. It has become so familiar that you almost stop noticing it. Almost. But you did notice. That is exactly why you are here. And you start to explain it away. Maybe he's busy. He had a hard day. He's just not that kind of person. He doesn't like texting. He will show himself differently. He expresses everything in another way. Maybe the message didn't go through. Maybe he didn't see it. Maybe. Have you ever noticed how much energy goes into this? How much strength you spend trying to explain someone else's silence so that it doesn't hurt, so that it doesn't mean what it might actually mean? Today, we are going to talk about this honestly, truly, without softening, without false comfort, without those beautiful words that leave you in the same uncertainty, just in a prettier package. Because his silence is also a message, one of the most informative messages you will ever receive. And today, you will learn how to read it for real, in a way no one has ever taught you before. Stay here until the very end, because in the middle of this conversation, there will be a moment many will want to skip. A moment containing something uncomfortable, something difficult to accept. But that specific moment is the most important. That is what changes everything. It is after that moment that you will look at the situation differently, more clearly, more freely. But first, we need to deal with something basic. Why silence affects us so deeply in the first place. Why is the absence of an answer sometimes more painful than a bad answer? Why does the silence of a phone in your hand feel like something physical, like a blow to the chest, only slow and stretched out over time? This is not weakness. It is nothing to be ashamed of. It is biology. It is how the human brain is wired. And understanding this is vital before moving forward. Our brains are evolutionarily programmed to react to social rejection as a threat to survival. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal neurobiological reality. Millions of years ago, being rejected by the group meant being left alone, and surviving alone in the wild was nearly impossible. Therefore, the brain developed an extremely sensitive alarm system for social threats. And this system still works today. It doesn't know that times have changed. It doesn't know that an unread message isn't a matter of survival. It just reacts. This is why the anxiety from silence is so physical, so persistent. It's why you check your phone again and again, even knowing nothing has changed. It's not that you are overthinking. It's that your nervous system is doing exactly what it was created for, protecting you from a social threat. But here is the important part. This defense system creates one big problem. It forces us into what I call filling in the blanks. When an unclear signal arrives, and silence is exactly that, the brain starts to fill the gaps itself without your permission. It invents explanations, builds versions, and creates stories. And here is the most important thing that most people don't know. The brain doesn't fill these gaps with neutral information. It fills them with information that matches our level of anxiety. The higher the anxiety, the more negative the explanations the brain creates, and the more convincing they seem. This is called catastrophizing, and it happens automatically if you don't know how to work with it. But today, we won't work with anxiety. We will go the other way. We will work with reality, with what silence actually says when you know how to hear it, when you don't overthink or devalue it, but read it like a text, like a message that arrived without words. Because silence always says something specific, always, without exception. The only question is, what exactly? And that depends on many things. The context, the history of your relationship, what that silence was like before, what happened leading up to it, and the quality, temperature, and pattern of that silence itself. Let's start with the most important distinction, the very first and most fundamental one. The division that puts everything else in its place. There is silence that says, I am here, but I can't right now. And there is silence that says, I am not here, and I chose not to explain it. These are two fundamentally different messages with fundamentally different meanings. Confusing them is what creates the greatest pain. Because when you read the second as the first, you stay in a situation that destroys you while convincing yourself that everything is fine, that it's just a little longer, that he will show up, that you understand everything correctly. And when you read the first as the second, you lose something real because of a fear that wasn't about reality, but about your nervous system. So, let's get clear. The first type of silence, I'm here, but I can't right now, has several specific characteristics. First, it is temporary and has an explanation. Not necessarily an immediate explanation, but one that eventually comes. He returns and says where he was, what was happening, what was difficult or busy, or what required all his attention. He doesn't let the silence hang in the air indefinitely. He closes it. He comes back. Second, this silence does not repeat as a pattern. It isn't something that happens over and over in the same circumstances. It is an exception, not the rule. It happens, and then it's gone. His silence is not the structure of your relationship. It is an episode. Third, while he is silent, everything else doesn't vanish. When he reappears, he appears fully. His attention, his presence, his interest in you, they haven't diminished. He hasn't become more distant overall. There was just a period of silence, and then he returned just as present. Fourth, there is no punishment in his silence. This is very important. Sometimes people are silent not because they are busy or overwhelmed, but because they want you to feel it. They want the silence to do something to you. This is a different kind of silence. Silence as a tool. A silence that says, I am punishing you for something, or I want you to come to me first, or I am testing how hard you will try. This is toxic silence. It is manipulation, not communication. And the difference between that and the silence of someone who actually needs space is felt physically, in the tension that his silence creates, in whether there is something cold and intentional in it, or just the emptiness of a busy person. The fifth characteristic of the first type of silence. When he returns, there is no ice between you, no thin, almost invisible distance that says something has changed. He returns, and he is the same person, the same tone, the same temperature of the relationship, as if there was no pause, or there was, but it didn't change what is between you. If you recognize his silence in this description, that is vital information. This is silence that likely says exactly what it says literally. I am here, I just can't right now. And the work here is different. You don't need to read a catastrophe. Here, you might need to tell him quietly, without blame, that it's important for you to understand when he will be unavailable, that you need that small bit of clarity, not to control him, but so your nervous system doesn't build catastrophes in the void of his silence. This is an honest and adult conversation, and if he is a person who has chosen you, he will hear it. Maybe not immediately, maybe not perfectly, but he will hear it. Now the second type of silence, the one that says, I am not here, and I chose not to explain it. This is the hard part, the part I warned you about at the beginning, the one you want to skip because accepting it means accepting something painful. But this is where all the value of today's conversation lies. This is where the clarity you've perhaps been seeking for a long time is found. Silence of the second type has its own characteristics, and they are very specific. First, it is systemic. It's not an episode, it's a pattern. It's what repeats again and again in similar circumstances. You've noticed this, that his silence isn't accidental, that it happens at certain moments, under certain conditions, as if by some logic that you don't fully understand, but that clearly exists. Here is what's important to understand about systemic silence. It speaks about priorities, not about busyness or character. Exactly about priorities, because people always find time for what is important to them. This is one of the harshest and most honest laws of human behavior. A person who says, I am very busy, yet is active on social media, responds to others, and finds time for things they enjoy. That person is not busy. That person has set priorities, and you are not at the top of them. This is painful to read, I know, but it is a truth you deserve to know. The second characteristic of the second type of silence is that it doesn't close. He doesn't come back later and explain. He doesn't say, "Sorry, I was busy. Here is what was happening." He just disappears and then reappears, as if nothing happened, as if the silence was the norm, as if you didn't need explanations, or as if he didn't even notice the silence existed. This tells you something very specific about how he thinks of you, about whether he thinks you need clarity, whether your feelings are important, whether his absence affects you, and whether that impact matters. If he reappears after silence and doesn't notice it existed, or notices and doesn't think it's necessary to explain it, that is a message, a very specific message about how much space you occupy in his inner world. Third, during his silence, you discover that he isn't silent at all. He is active online, writing to others, present in the world, just not in yours. This is an especially painful kind of silence because there is no longer the option to explain it as busyness. There is only one explanation: choice. He chooses whom to give his time to. And in that moment, he is not choosing you. The fourth characteristic: his silence creates a certain dynamic in you. You start trying harder. You write again. You look for a reason to get in touch. You do something to win back his attention. You become a little less yourself and a little more of what you think he would want to see. This is called anxious attachment, activated by inconsistent reinforcement. It is one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms that exist, and people who create this pattern, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, create a dependency in another person that has nothing to do with love. It is a dependency on uncertainty, on the moment he finally appears, on the relief after the anxiety. This is not love. It is the chemistry of stress, and it feels very, very much like love, especially from the inside. If you recognize your situation in this, stop. This is important. It doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means the pattern you are in is not about love. It's about something else. And what you feel for him, it is real. Your feelings are real, but the situation is not love. It is something that mimics love through the mechanism of anxiety and relief, and this can be changed, but only if you call it by its name. The fifth characteristic of the second type of silence, the quietest and most destructive, is what it does to your self-perception. You start to doubt yourself. You start to think, what did I do wrong? What was wrong with my message? Maybe I wrote something that pushed him away. Maybe I was too much or too little, or wrong, or off. This is a very specific form of harm that one person's silence causes another. It shifts the responsibility. The person who is silent without explanation forces the other person to look for the reason for that silence within themselves. And we look for it because it gives the illusion of control. If it's my mistake, I can fix it. If I did something wrong, I can do it differently. It feels better than admitting that the silence is simply his choice, unrelated to you, not your responsibility, just his choice. Because admitting that means admitting you can't control it, you can't fix it, it's not about you, and therefore there is nothing you can do to change it. This is a difficult admission, but it is a liberating one. Because when you stop looking for the reason in yourself, you begin to see the situation clearly. And clarity is the beginning of everything. The beginning of right decisions, the beginning of moving toward where you feel better. Now, about what happens between these two types of silence. Real life is rarely that distinct. Rarely is silence entirely of the first type or entirely of the second. More often, it's something in the middle, something that mixes both, something that creates that very uncertainty that is so hard to navigate. There is the silence of a person who is afraid. This is a special kind, and it deserves a separate conversation. Because a person who is afraid remains silent, not because they don't care. They are silent precisely because they care too much, because it is too important. because saying something means making it real, and the real can be lost. The real requires decisions. The real takes you out of your comfort zone and safety. This silence of fear looks different from the silence of indifference, and it is very important to distinguish them. The silence of fear is uncomfortable. You feel a tension in it, something that says, there is something here. It's just stuck. It's not empty. It's full, just bottled up. You feel his presence even in the silence. You feel that he is thinking, experiencing, wanting to say something and not saying it. The silence of indifference, however, is exactly that, empty. There is no tension in it, no feeling of something being stuck. It is simply an absence. And that absence is a very specific feeling. It's hard to describe, but very easy to recognize. You already know the difference. You felt it in that place inside that knows before it thinks. Perhaps you just didn't allow yourself to trust what you felt, because trusting means admitting, and admitting is sometimes painful. Now, another very important type of silence to discuss. Silence after a conflict, after something difficult happened between you, after a moment that was sharp, painful, and heavy. This silence is one of the hardest to interpret because it can mean very different things. When you are already wounded, his silence feels especially sharp, especially like a threat. The male nervous system, and I say this not as a generalization, but as a physiological reality documented in research, reacts to conflict in a relationship differently than the female one. It stays in a state of stress longer and takes longer to return to its baseline. This is why many men go into silence during or immediately after a conflict. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system literally cannot process the conflict and communicate productively at the same time. This is not an excuse for endless silence. It is an explanation of its nature. Because understanding the nature of something is the first step to working with it. The key question with silence after a conflict is not why it exists, but how it ends. Does it end at all? Does he return? And how? What does he return with? With a desire to figure things out, or a desire to act like nothing happened? With a readiness for a real conversation, or with a superficial, well, everything's fine, that closes the topic without solving anything of substance? If he returns and returns to the conversation, to what happened, to how it was for both of you, that is good silence. Temporary, regulating, honest. He took time to calm down and think clearly, and he returned to be truly present. If he returns and acts like nothing happened, or the silence continues indefinitely, or he waits for you to come first and by coming, automatically relieve the tension without a real talk. That is silence of usage. It is a silence that says, what happened between us isn't important to me. What matters is that you come, that you give in, that the situation resolves without my participation in the resolution. This is a crucial distinction because the first silence is healthy and functional. The second is a structural problem in how he builds relationships. Now, let's talk about what to do. Because understanding silence is important, but understanding without action is just a more educated form of pain. The first thing you need to do is stop filling his silence with your explanations. This is the hardest and most important step, because as long as you explain for him, you deprive yourself of the chance to see reality. You create a story that suits you, and live in that story, rather than in what is actually happening. Silence is a given. It is a fact. What stands behind it is a question that has no answer without information, and the only source of that information is him, not your explanations, not your friends' versions, not what you read in his past messages or in his behavior when you try to assemble the puzzle, but him. And this leads us to the second step, the conversation. That direct, slightly difficult, slightly vulnerable conversation that most people avoid because it requires courage, because it requires a readiness to hear the answer. Any answer, even the one that hurts. But here is what I know for sure. Any answer is better than uncertainty. Any clarity is better than the anxiety that lives in the void of his silence. Because with an answer, You can do something. You can make a decision to move, to react from reality rather than from an imaginary script. With uncertainty, you can only wait and worry and explain and wait again. That is not living. It is waiting to live. What does this conversation look like? Not as an accusation like, "Why do you never answer?" That triggers a defensive reaction and shuts a person down rather than opening them up. Not as an ultimatum, because an ultimatum given before you know the reality is a decision made before you have information. It sounds something like this. When there is a long silence between us, I don't know how to understand it. It's important for me to understand what silence means to you, what it says about you and about us. This is not a demand. It is a request for understanding. This is you taking responsibility for your own clarity, not shifting everything onto him, but also not accepting uncertainty as the norm. His response to this conversation is, in itself, a huge piece of information. A person who chooses you will hear this. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not immediately, but he will hear it. He will do something about it, say something real, try to explain, try to be different. A person who doesn't care or who finds it important not to be honest with you will react differently. He might get defensive. He might blame you for being too demanding. He might disappear again. And that is also a message, a very specific, very clear one. The third thing you need to do is pay attention to how you feel in this relationship overall. Not just in the moments of silence, but in total. When you think about this relationship, what prevails? Warmth or anxiety? Calmness or constant monitoring of his mood? A sense of yourself or a loss of yourself in attempts to adjust, guess, and not scare him away? Because relationships, any relationships, not just romantic ones, should, in total, give you more than they take. Not every moment, not every day. Life isn't linear, and relationships can be hard, but truly, in total. If anxiety prevails in total, that is vital information. It's not a sentence for him or for the relationship, but it is vital information that something isn't working, that something requires change, either in the situation or in how you are participating in it. Fourth, and this is something rarely mentioned in such talks, is to look at your own silence, at what you aren't saying to him. Because sometimes his silence is a mirror. Sometimes the space between two people fills with silence from both sides. Sometimes you also don't say something important out of fear, insecurity, or an unwillingness to be vulnerable. This is not an accusation, it is an invitation to honesty. If you want there to be more words, more clarity, and more openness between you, sometimes one of the two must take the first step. And sometimes that person can be you. Not because it's your responsibility to decide for both, but because you want this relationship. Because you are brave enough for this step. Because your need for clarity is real, and you have the right to declare it. And fifth, here is the most important part, is to remember that his silence is information about him, not about you. It's about where he is, what he can or cannot do at this moment, about his level of maturity, readiness, and desire to be in a relationship that requires real presence. It is not your deficiency. It is not your mistake. It is not something you should have done differently. You wrote, you were open, you were yourself. You cannot control how he reacts to that. You can only control how you react to his reaction, or the lack thereof. And here is what I want you to take from this conversation. Not as a theory, but as something living that stays with you. You deserve a person whose silence does not create anxiety in you. A person whose silence, when it exists, is explainable and temporary. A person who understands that his silence affects you and to whom that impact matters. Not because you demand constant attention, but because you are a person whose feelings have meaning, whose inner life is real, whose need for clarity is a normal, healthy human need. You are not too much. Your need to know is not a weakness. It is what is called healthy attachment. It is how love should look, with clarity, with presence, with a readiness to explain one's silence to the person who matters. And if you are currently in a situation where his silence has become the norm, where you've already grown used to the silence and learned to explain it so that it doesn't hurt, I want to tell you something very directly. A habit of pain is not acceptance. It is not wisdom. It is not, I've learned not to depend on his attention. It is an adaptation to something that should not be the norm. It is your nervous system that has learned to survive in conditions where you shouldn't have to survive. You deserve better. Not someone perfect, not someone without flaws, without difficult moments, or without periods when they can't be fully present, but a person for whom your clarity is important, for whom your feeling matters, who doesn't leave you in the void of his silence, not because it is always filled, but because when it exists, you know why, and you know it is temporary, and you know that behind it, he is real, choosing you. That is what his silence means. Not one single thing, not a simple answer, but a very specific, very readable system of signals. If you know what to look for. Now you know. Use this knowledge not to analyze and worry, but to see clearly, to make decisions based on reality, to build what is real, or to walk away from what is not. You deserve clarity. You deserve presence. You deserve a person whose silence, if it exists at all, does not destroy you, but is simply a pause between two real moments together. Write in the comments what you felt while listening to this. Did you recognize your silence or his silence in what I talked about? What hit you the hardest? Share this video with a friend who is currently looking at her phone, waiting and not knowing what to do with that waiting. Maybe these exact words will give her what she is looking for. Subscribe, because every conversation here is this honest and direct for you, without the pretty packaging around the uncomfortable truth. Until next time. And remember, his silence speaks, always. You just know how to hear it now.